step down, Scar.
Oh, okay, well, I would, naturally. However, there is one little problem. You see them?
Scar wasn't always called Scar. His real name was Taka, which in Swahili means waste or trash. Let that sink in. From the moment he was born, his own father labeled him as something disposable, while his brother, Mufasa, was literally named King. Imagine growing up knowing you were never meant to matter. What if Scar wasn't just a villain, but a victim of a past that broke him before he even had a chance? Scar's backstory is much darker than most people realize. We all know him as the cunning, jealous villain from The Lion King. But his journey to becoming that twisted and bitter lion started long before he plotted against Mufasa. His story is one of rejection, neglect, and a desperate need for validation that was never met. Scar wasn't born evil. He was shaped by the world around him, by a father who never saw his worth, by a brother who unknowingly overshadowed him, and by a kingdom that left him on the sidelines. Imagine growing up knowing that no matter what you do, you'll never be good enough. That was Scar's reality from the very beginning. He lived in the shadow of Mufasa, who was always treated as the rightful heir, the strong one, the chosen one. Meanwhile, Scar was constantly reminded that he was less important, less valued, and ultimately, less loved.
Kill him.
And what does that do to someone? It chips away at their sense of self-worth. It fills them with resentment. It makes them question their place in the world. Scar didn't just wake up one day and decide to be a villain. He was pushed to that point, shaped by years of neglect and rejection. The sad part, if things had been different, if he had been shown the same love and respect as his brother, his story could have turned out completely different. Instead, he became the lion we all know, bitter, vengeful, and desperate to prove that he was more than just the forgotten son. Scar's tragedy began at birth. His father, King Ahadi, didn't just favor Mufasa. He diminished Scar's worth from the start. His original name, Taka, meant waste or trash in Swahili, while Mufasa's meant king. Imagine being born into royalty only to be named something worthless. That alone was enough to plant the seed of resentment. Names hold meaning. They shape the way people see you, and more importantly, the way you see yourself. When a parent names their child something negative, it's almost like they're deciding that child's fate from birth. And that's exactly what happened to Scar. With a name like Taka, what chance did he ever have? He wasn't just seen as second best. He was seen as unworthy from the start. And the worst part? He knew it. He felt it every single day. Can you imagine what it must have been like to grow up knowing your father named you something that meant worthless, while your brother was called king? It's no wonder Scar grew up feeling like he had something to prove. He wasn't just battling Mufasa for the throne. He was battling the identity that had been forced upon him from the moment he was born. And when someone feels like they're constantly fighting just to be seen, that fight can turn into something much darker.
I am the king. I can do whatever I want.
It wasn't just about the name, though. Ahadi raised Mufasa as his golden child, grooming him to be king while barely acknowledging Scar. He was the prince who was never meant to be. And the worst part? Everyone knew it. The pride knew it. The animals of the kingdom knew it. And Scar himself knew it. Imagine growing up in your sibling's shadow, watching them get all the love, praise, and opportunities while you're ignored. Scar wasn't weak. He was intelligent and strategic. But none of that mattered because he wasn't Mufasa. In A Tale of Two Brothers, when Ahadi cancels a hunting trip, he doesn't comfort Scar. Instead, he scolded him and praised Mufasa for understanding kingly responsibilities. Once again, Scar was reminded that his brother was the future, while he was just an afterthought. When a child grows up constantly being compared to their sibling and told that they aren't enough, it changes them. It builds resentment, it creates anger, and eventually, it can turn into something much worse. Scar didn't just want the throne for power. He wanted it because, for once, he wanted to feel like he was more than just the forgotten son. Scar spent his life trying to prove himself, only to be ignored or shut down. Desperate, he set up Mufasa to be embarrassed by a Cape buffalo, but the plan backfired. Mufasa escaped, while Scar was badly injured, leaving him with his infamous scar. And Ahadi? Instead of offering comfort, he simply told his son, "You brought this on yourself." That moment changed Scar forever. He wasn't just physically wounded, he was emotionally scarred. He started to believe that no matter what he did, he would always be second best. He would always be the lesser son. And that's when the resentment turned into something much darker. Imagine being a young cub, hurt and vulnerable, looking to your father for comfort, and instead being met with cold indifference. Instead of kindness, you're given a lesson in failure. Instead of reassurance, you're told that your pain is your fault. That's exactly what happened to Scar. And from that moment on, the bitterness inside him started to grow. The scar on his face became more than just a wound. It became a reminder of everything he wasn't.
Murderer. Simba, please have mercy.
A reminder that he would always be seen as the weaker son. A reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be Mufasa. And when someone is constantly reminded of their failures, eventually they stop trying to prove themselves the right way. Instead, they take matters into their own hands. And that's exactly what Scar did. There was a time when Scar could have been something more than just the villain we know today. In some versions of his backstory, like the Lion Guard, his original name was Askari, named after a noble ancestor. And in that version, Scar wasn't always bitter and filled with resentment. He was a protector of the Pride Lands, a lion who carried the responsibility of the roar of the elders, a powerful ability that allowed him to command great forces. For a while, he believed he had a purpose. He believed that he could be something great. But like everything else in his life, that purpose was taken away from him. Scar's downfall wasn't entirely his fault at first. He was manipulated into using the roar for his gain, tricked by a deceptive lion who played on his insecurities. And when he finally gave in to temptation, it backfired in the worst possible way. He lost his powers, and with them, he lost the last piece of himself that felt worthy. It wasn't just about losing his ability, it was about losing his place. Imagine dedicating your life to something, only to have it ripped away after one mistake. Instead of being guided back, Scar was cast aside, confirming his worst fear. He wasn't needed, respected, or destined for greatness. The 2019 live-action version of The Lion King gave us a twist that changed everything. Up until then, the story of how Scar got his signature injury was always a little unclear. Most versions say he got it after a fight with a Cape buffalo, a plan he had set in motion. But the live-action movie suggests something much darker. In this version, it's heavily implied that Mufasa was the one who gave Scar the scar.
Well, look who's come down to mingle with the commoners.
Sarabi and I didn't see you at the presentation of Simba.
And that their rivalry was much deeper than we originally thought. If this is true, it means that Scar once challenged Mufasa for the throne directly, and he lost. And not just lost, he was physically wounded and left humiliated. Imagine the pain of that moment. Scar had probably been waiting his entire life for a chance to prove that he was just as worthy as Mufasa. Maybe he believed that if he could beat his brother, he could finally earn his father's respect. But instead, he walked away with a permanent mark of his failure. And Ahadi? He did nothing to stop it. He let them fight as if proving dominance through violence was the only way to settle the matter. The scar wasn't just a wound, it was a message. It told Scar that he would never be the king, that he would always be second, that no matter what he did, he would never be Mufasa. And if the 2019 version is to be believed, Mufasa himself made sure Scar never forgot it. Now, I know what some people might say. Well, that doesn't justify what Scar did later, and you'd be right. He still made his own choices. He still let his bitterness consume him. But can we blame him for feeling the way he did? Imagine spending your entire life in someone's shadow, never being given the same love, respect, or opportunities. Imagine being labeled as lesser from the moment you were born.
We're not going anywhere.
Then you have sentenced us to death.
Then so be it.
That kind of pain doesn't just disappear, it festers. And in Scar's case, it turned into a hunger for power, for validation, for revenge. For years, Scar had tried to be seen, tried to be valued. He had tried to earn his place in the Pride Lands, but every attempt ended the same way, with him being pushed aside. His father never saw his worth. His brother overpowered him. His kingdom never considered him a real leader, so eventually he stopped playing by their rules. He decided that if the circle of life had no place for him, he would break it. He would take what he had been denied. Scar's transformation into a villain didn't happen overnight. It was years of rejection, years of knowing he was never going to be king. Not because he lacked the intelligence, but because he lacked the approval of those who decided who was worthy. By the time he plotted against Mufasa, it wasn't just about power. It was about finally taking what he had been denied his whole life. And in his mind, that wasn't betrayal, it was justice. That's why his alliance with the hyenas makes so much sense. The hyenas were outcasts, just like him. The Pride Lands had cast them aside, deemed them unworthy. Scar saw himself in them. He wasn't just using them for power. On some level, he likely sympathized with them. They were all misfits, all rejected by the so-called circle of life. Think about it. Scar spent his whole life being told he wasn't enough, that he didn't belong, and that he wasn't fit to rule. The hyenas lived with that reality every single day. They were starving, struggling, and forced to survive in the shadows while the lions enjoyed everything. And Scar, more than anyone, understood what it felt like to be denied a place in this world. It makes sense that he saw them as allies, as kindred spirits. But here's where it all went wrong. Scar wasn't leading out of unity or fairness. He was leading out of anger. He believed that because he had been mistreated, he had the right to take whatever he wanted, however he wanted. And that's what ultimately led to his downfall.
One thumb as big as your head. No, I would never have had to do this for Mufasa.
Scar may have found a connection with the hyenas, but he ruled them with fear, just like he ruled the Pride Lands. Instead of creating a kingdom where everyone belonged, he created a kingdom built on his own pain. And that's why it could never last. And that's where Scar's rule went so wrong. He thought taking the throne would finally give him the respect he craved. He believed that if he became king, he could prove himself to Mufasa's ghost and everyone that he was just as good, no, better than the brother who always overshadowed him. But deep down, I don't think he ever truly believed it. And that's the real tragedy. Scar didn't just rule with fear, he ruled with insecurity. Instead of being a leader, he became a dictator, obsessed with keeping power rather than earning it. A real king leads with wisdom and care. Scar led with desperation. Not because he trusted them, but because he needed followers. He needed someone, anyone, to validate him. But fear and manipulation only get you so far. He was never a true king because deep inside, he didn't even believe he deserved the throne. The Pride Lands didn't fall apart just because of bad leadership. They fell apart because Scar was never leading. He was clinging to power, terrified of losing it. Scar's reign was doomed from the start, paranoid and desperate to prove himself. He ruled not to strengthen the kingdom, but to heal a lifelong wound. Becoming king didn't fix him. It only exposed his deepest weakness. Scar's downfall wasn't just about Simba coming back. It was about Scar destroying himself. His paranoia, his mistrust, his inability to truly lead, it all stemmed from those early wounds. He spent his whole life trying to prove his worth, and in the end, he only proved his worst fear, that he was never meant to rule. The moment he became king, he was faced with the reality of leadership. He thought that the throne would finally give him the respect he always wanted, but it didn't. The lionesses didn't admire him. The kingdom didn't thrive under him. Even the hyenas, his allies, eventually started questioning him. And that's the worst thing for someone like Scar. He needed control, he needed validation, and when he didn't get it, he fell apart. His reign was filled with bad decisions, but none of them were as disastrous as his final mistake.
No, you don't understand. No, I didn't mean... No, I didn't play no.
Turning on the hyenas. Scar was already losing his grip, but the moment he threw them under the bus, blaming them for his failures, it was over. He had spent years using them, making them believe he was their savior. And in the end, he betrayed them like everyone had betrayed him. That's why they turned on him. That's why he had nowhere left to run.
Ed?
Scar's entire life had been about proving he was more than the weak, forgotten prince. But in the end, he proved exactly what everyone had always believed. And that's the real tragedy. And what if Ahadi had been a better father? What if Scar had been given the same encouragement as Mufasa? Would he still have turned to darkness? Would he still have let the bitterness consume him? We'll never know for sure, but one thing is for certain. Scar's story is not as simple as he was the bad guy. It's the story of a neglected son, a wounded brother, and a lion who was never given a chance to be anything other than the villain. Maybe if Ahadi had nurtured Scar's intelligence, if he had valued his strategic mind instead of dismissing it, things could have been different. Maybe Scar could have been an advisor, a trusted figure in Mufasa's reign instead of an enemy. The Pride Land had 2 princes, but only one was ever truly raised to be a leader. Scar wasn't just left out, he was pushed out. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a message that he wasn't needed, that he wasn't important. And what does someone do when they're told over and over again that they don't matter? They either fade into the background or they fight back. Scar chose to fight, not because he was evil, but because he refused to be forgotten. And that's why his story is so heartbreaking. It didn't have to be this way. Maybe with just a little more love and a little more care, Scar could have been something else. But that's not the story he got. So the next time you watch The Lion King, take a closer look at Scar. Listen to the way he speaks, the way he carries himself. He's not just a power-hungry villain. He's a lion who spent his whole life fighting to be seen. And in the end, the fight was the very thing that destroyed him. It's easy to hate him for what he did, but it's also hard not to feel a little sorry for him. He wasn't born evil. He became what the world made him. Every villain starts somewhere. And Scar's story didn't start with power-hungry schemes. It started with a father who never believed in him, a brother who unintentionally overshadowed him, and a kingdom that had no place for him. When you think about it that way, it makes Scar's final moments even sadder. He wasn't just losing a battle. He was losing the last shred of the dream he had chased his whole life. He had spent every moment trying to prove that he was better, that he was strong, that he was worthy. And in the end, it was all for nothing. The kingdom fell apart, his allies turned on him, and he died alone. Just as he had lived, forgotten, unwanted, and desperately trying to hold on to a throne that was never truly his. Maybe if things had been different, he could have been something more. But for Scar, there was never another path.